Reverend Gabriel Salguero is the founder and president of the National Latino Evangelical Coalition, NALEC. He also pastors a church in Orlando called The Gathering Place. His wife, Jeanette, is also ordained, and they share in the leadership of both NALEC and The Gathering Place. He has a really interesting academic and theological background. I think he'll talk a bit about that. I asked Gabe to talk about the complexity of Latino politics, especially on the politics of poverty, the role of religion, and the development of NALEC. Gabe, we're glad to have you with us.
So nice to meet each of you, even if virtually, and thanks for the honor for letting us share a little bit of Latino faith engagement. I am a member of the Hispanic Evangelical community in the US. I am a Jersey Rican. That means I was born in New Jersey of Puerto Rican parents. My wife, Jeanette, is a New Yorican. That means she's a Puerto Rican, born in New York of Puerto Rican parents. And our two sons, one is a Jersey Rican and one is a New Yorican. So we've divided that equally. NALEC has a broad coalition of Latina evangelicals. So it's Mexican, Colombian, Argentine, Venezuelan, so forth, Dominican, so forth and so on. Chicano, they each self-identify in different ways. And so we're respectful of how they self-identify. NALEC has been around. NALEC is the acronym of the coalition, National Latino Evangelical Coalition, for about 11 years. David is a humble person, but he's the first to receive our Anti-Poverty and Hunger Champion Award some years ago when he was doing his work at Bread for the World, both as an economist and faith advocate. And so David is, as he's quite rightly said, a friend and a leader. Before I was the head of NALEC, I was the director of the Institute of Faith and Public Life at Princeton Theological Seminary. I did my PhD work at Union Theological Seminary. I worked with a gentleman called James Cohn. I was his teaching assistant. Before he passed, and another gentleman called Larry Rasmussen, who's a kind of earth ethicist, and a wonderful woman called Emily Towns before she went on to be at Vanderbilt. She's a womanist scholar. I was also the archivist for Ada Maria Isase Diaz Mujeristas papers at the Union Theological Seminary Library. So anything she ever read, I read and are archived for the Union Seminary Library when I was a PhD student. I am an Assemblies of God pastor, and so you will find very few evangelicals who did PhD work at Union, but here's one. I'm not the only one, actually. There are several others. Michelle Torres, Samuel Sullivan, and others, and a lot of that training in kind of liberation theologies for my public work in Latina liberation theologies and other liberation theologies for my kind of public engagement. But so did my formation in a Pentecostal indigenous church, Latino Pentecostal church. My father and mother have been ordained for 41 years. My mother was one of the first Latina ordained in the Pentecostal tradition in the 70s. And she's still very much ordained, and she's the pastor of the church I grew up in. I think she was ordained in 1978. And so that's my tradition. Jeanette is also ordained in the Assemblies of God tradition. She went to Duke, and her formation is both in organizational psychology, administration. NALEC is about 3,000 Hispanic evangelical congregations across the country. And we are committed to the common good and public advocacy from a gospel-centered perspective. I think that's enough biography for now, but I especially for the people who are GTU and other places, I thought I'd bring some of the more theological, social ethics background, lest people assume he's an evangelical, he hasn't engaged other thinkers. So I'm not confused. I'm just integrated. I want to say that the work of NALEC is deeply indebted to some of the work that David Beckmann and Bread for the World and honestly, the theological formation of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and their moral theology. Much of the Catholic social teaching has informed NALEC's approach to public theologies and to public policies. And so we're deeply indebted to Catholic social teaching and Dorothy Day and others who have had a real influence in my personal work. My master's degree work was on Martin Luther King Jr. as a public advocate, and Pedro Albizu Campos, who is a Puerto Rican lawyer, independentista who fought for Puerto Rican independence. I'd like to talk a little bit about Hispanicity or Latinidad in America. I'll give you that kind of 30,000 foot view. If you already know it, then indulge me. There's things that I just want to make sure we're using some working language. Let me just talk just about a few statistical matters that you may or may not know. And I'm taking most of this kind of statistics either from the census from Pew or from PRRI, Public Religion Research Institute. We start with the assumption that we are not a monolith, okay? And we're changing. We are changing. So I'm giving you a comparative analysis between the 2013 Pew and the 2018-2019. On the right, on my right, is the 2013 Pew numbers, where Catholics were 55% of the Hispanic population in the US. Now they're 47%. They've actually had a reduction. And these are people who self-identified as such. Protestants are 24%. They used to be 22%. Of the Protestants, that's both mainline and evangelical. Of that group, 67% self-identify as evangelical or born again. Okay, so 67% of the 24% of the Protestants. Then you have, there's 1% Latino, Latina Mormons, Jewish, atheist, agnostic. And actually the fastest growing group used to be Hispanic, Latino, Latina evangelicals, but it is now the religiously non-affiliated. That's the fastest growing group among Latinos and Latinas. And so that's a sense. The last census put Latinos in the US at around 60 million. Around 60 million. That was actually the mid-census. We're talking about 2015. We'll see what the 2020 census brings to us. But just for a sense, if Latinos in the US were a country by itself, they would be the second largest Latino country in the world. Okay, so there are more Latinos in the US than there are in Paraguay and Uruguay combined, for example, and certainly more than Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic combined. So that's just a sense. Of that group, we're talking over 12 million self-identify as evangelical, and over 28 million self-identify as Catholic. So those are the two largest groups. And the not affiliated is close to 11 million, according to the last census. So just for us to get a sense. This is, I think, a good starting place for us to, it may be obvious, but I need to state it for reasons of mental health, and also for reasons that we were on a call today with the White House, with Latino faith leaders in the White House faith-based office. And one of the things we try to tell policymakers over and over is that Latinos, Latinas are not a monolith, right? Like no group is a monolith. And obviously this was a group of Hispanic evangelicals that were on the call with the White House, but even Hispanic evangelicals are not a monolith, as Hispanic Catholics are not a monolith, Hispanic Jews are not a monolith. No group is a monolith, but it needs to be said over and over again, because I think that when we start creating pan identities, as what happens in the US with immigrant groups, right? The pan-Asian identity, the pan-Latino, identity, we often lose nuance, right? So if we have a pan-Asian identity, right, we call Asian Americans. Well, there's Japanese, there's Korean, there's Chinese, there's Tibetan, and so some of that needs to be articulated. And as is so with the pan-Latino, Latina identity, right? Mexican, Puerto Rican, Colombian, Guatemalan, Salvadorian, Cuban, so forth. U.S.-born Latinos, which, by the way, 2/3 of Latinos living in the United States are U.S. born, right? So the majority of the group is not born outside the United States. The majority of the group is U.S. born, and for the most part are either bilingual, and the younger groups being English dominant and sometimes monolingual. So I just want to say that the largest three groups, faith groups, are Catholic, as I said, 28 million, Protestant/Evangelical, so we're talking 13 million or so. Remember, I keep saying or so because census often undercounts Hispanic populations, right? Especially undocumented persons. And so that's why I'm being very careful in saying that, because every person counts in the theology that I ascribe to. And then of course, the 11 or so million of religiously non-affiliated, okay? The world. Here was an analysis that PRRI took on how Hispanic faith groups viewed the Trump administration. Just to get an idea, because sometimes we have flat depictions of Hispanicity or Latinidad, okay? And you'll see that 57% of Hispanic Protestants approved of how Trump was doing. I just, off the record, I was not part of that 57%. And so, and 58% of, so I'm looking at my tribe right now, the Hispanic Protestants, of which 67% are evangelical. More than half approved of how Trump handled the economy and approved of him as president. 45% approved of how he handled, or his administration handled, racial justice protests. And 38% handled how the Trump administration responded to the coronavirus pandemic. This is interesting because if you look at Hispanic Catholics, not so much, right? 27% approved of him as a president, 42% approved of how the president handled the economy, 30% approved of how he handled racial justice, and 29% approved of how he responded, his administration, to the coronavirus. What's interesting about this graph, and the reason I chose it as one of the early ones, is because it gives you kind of a spectrum of Hispanicity and how faith impacts how they view policy. In this case, an anecdotal look at a particular administration's, the most recent administration. Look at how Hispanic religiously unaffiliated compare to Hispanic Protestants. They're almost always on opposite, not almost always in this chart, always on opposite spectrums. If we had a chart on immigration, there would be much more synergy across these things. But this is an interesting thing to show how faith, dogmas, doctrine, ideology impacts how we look at presidential administrations and their responses to our communities, or national crises in the case of racial justice, and in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, in the case of the economy. Can I just be honest with you? That's all I know how to do. Is the 58 on the handling of the economy, when I did this research, surprised me. Especially since most of the work that I've done with religious leaders, which is Catholic bishops and Latino, Latina, evangelical denominational leaders, has been around earned income tax credit, child tax credit, SNAP, WIC. It doesn't reflect this. And so what I want to add to this layer is that often the national surveys of grassroots is not the same as if you did a national service of what is often called grass tops leaders, denominational leaders. So there is often a chasm between where Latino, Latina, and let me say, I should say this right up front. I know the term Latinx. I know it very well. You will notice that I do not use it because although most Latinos, Latinas are aware of it, according to surveys, only 3% use it. And so it is, that 3% is the 3% that I mostly work with in the academy and in public policy. But the term Latinx is not deeply embedded in the Latino, Latina community. It is usually in academia and in public policy circles and in governance. Here's another kind of taxonomy that helps us understand Hispanic ideological makeup. So Latinos and Latinas or Hispanic Americans, 37% identify as Democrats, 25% as independents, and 21% as Republicans. And so it's a fascinating thing that how, and this can switch from election to election. For example, in the Latino evangelical community, President Obama won the Latino evangelical vote both times he ran, as did President George W. Bush won the Latino evangelical vote both times he ran. I believe Hillary may have won a slim majority over Trump when she ran against him, but it's a pretty diverse group. Hispanic Catholics mirror to a great deal the self-identification of the larger Hispanic American demographic. 41% are Democrats, 20% are independent, 19% are Republicans. Hispanic Protestants are usually the most politically conservative of them, 28% Republican, Democrat, 32% Republican, 31% independent. And look how large the independent group is among Hispanic Protestants. And oftentimes I did an interview in the New York Times a few years ago where I was quoted as saying we're the quintessential swing voter in terms of the faith voter. So that's important because now I'm not speaking for me as an individual, but our Hispanic evangelical tend to be socially conservative, but progressive on economics, housing, immigration, and other things. And of the group, the religiously unaffiliated Hispanics are the largest democratically identified, 46%, 22% independent, and 7% Republicans. This is important because this is the fastest growing group among Hispanic millennials and Gen Zs. And so that's important for political pundits and those who are analyzing it. Hispanic Protestants are much more likely to say they are ideologically conservative, almost 40%. Hispanic Catholics at almost 20%, and those who are religiously unaffiliated at 12%. Okay, and this comes from PRRI. Let me give you one policy issue that is economics-based, immigration, right? I just finished saying that about 66% of Latinos, Latinas in the US are US born. That means a full third are immigrants. So look at this very interesting data. 35% of Hispanic Americans support building wall. Surprised by that. At the southern border with Mexico to keep immigrants out, right? Nearly half of those are Hispanic Protestants compared to 34% Catholics, and 50% of Hispanics who are religiously unaffiliated agree. Additionally, 45% of Hispanic Protestants support a law preventing refugees from entering the country. This is the ban on refugees, which got zeroed out in the previous administration and is presently, we're advocating for it to cap to be at 125,000 or at historic levels. There's been an oral agreement, although the present administration has not signed that yet. And so it's still not there. And so these are things that are important as people ask about Hispanic faith voters and Hispanic public engagement in general. Here's a view of government. And remember, this is important because immigrant groups have a varied history on government, whether they lived in Venezuela or Cuba or in Mexico or in Puerto Rico or or in Argentina, República Dominicana under Trujillo and others. And so that history informs how some Hispanic groups see the view of government and the role of government, especially when it comes to public assistance. And the side, Hispanics are more likely than the general public to say they would rather have a bigger government providing more services than a smaller government with fewer services. That's 75% of Hispanics say this, while 19% rather have a smaller government with fewer services. So contrast that to the general US public. We're almost at twice the rate asking for larger government with more social services. And that's significant when you start talking about public policy documents issued by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, by our coalition, the National Latino Evangelical Coalition, by the Latino Christian Churches Together, which is predominantly mainline, but not uniquely. And you'll see some of our public documents on the view of government, whether that's SNAP, whether that's WIC, whether that's public assistance or global, right? US aid, development, that view, this view of government is deeply reflected in the public pronunciations of some of these larger Latino, Latina faith groups. Although there are others like Libre Initiative and others who actually feel that should be the role of the church and not government, although I'm not sure how they articulate the church doing all of that. Let me say another layer of the last 5 years that have been important to Latino faith engagement, particularly in the areas of poverty and economics. Quite frankly, in the last 30 years, the Hispanic boom via immigration and birth. So 1 out of every 4 children born in the US is Hispanic. 1 out of every 4 children born in the US is Hispanic. 1 out of every 2 is a BIPOC, a Black, Indigenous, or person of color, okay? And so 1 out of every 4 children, we are a young demographic. Our median age is under 28 years of age. And the demographic boom has come either through immigration or through having children or family expansion. And so that has significantly impacted the migration from Central and South America, the Northern Triangle, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and increasingly from Venezuela, given the crises, political and economic crises in Venezuela have been significant. And from Puerto Rico, although that's not immigration, that's migration, because Puerto Ricans are US citizens, because of Hurricane Maria and the recent earthquakes. And that is a revolving door migration, cross-reference 1950s Puerto Rican revolving door migration, for those of you who've read some of those books about Puerto Rican revolving door migration. And so all of those factors given to the demographic boom, 1 out of every 4 children, has made Latinos and Latinas a political force to be reckoned with. The grassroots historically are dealing with survival.
We live in lament.
Right? Not policy nuance, right? We need to get the check to pay the rent this week, right? When all of these kind of nouveau white evangelicals started talking about lament, we were like, what took you so long? Now lament is trendy. Let's lament, let's all lament. And we're like, my goodness, have you read of the Chinese Exclusion Act or chattel slavery or segregation? I mean, we're going to lament now? No, I agree, we need to lament, but it's long overdue. And so the grassroots are not having conversation about Gustavo Gutierrez. They're not having conversations about the political economy of misery, as Emily Towns has written. So the translation has to be, how does SNAP impact Maria, Josefina, Juan, who worship Sunday? How does a major budget cut impact those people? Or how does it impact the growth of the soup kitchen line, right? And so here, this is not a small point, which most policy and theologians miss. Most Latino politically engaged pastors, I'm not talking about philosophers, economists, they get to policy advocacy from direct service. So their entry point is, man, that soup kitchen is getting longer. Man, there are more people who we have to, out of our benevolent fund, help them pay because Social Security is not enough for them to pay their mortgage at the end of the month. And so that realization from direct service leads them to advocacy. That's how we've mostly worked with the grassroots. So I don't have to preach to them that during COVID-19, the soup kitchen line got longer. I don't have to tell them that because they live it, right? And so now the next step is to tie how policy can help them serve those communities to which they feel called. That is a larger step because there's a historical distrust in some Latino communities of government. And so this kind of work, because of the distrust and because of language barriers and cultural barriers, makes Grasstops work. I will say this, the mainline Protestants are ahead and the Latino Catholics are ahead on this. And the truth is, if Latino, in opinion, not fact, this is not a fact, this is straight opinion. The Latino church could learn a lot more from the African-American church in this regard. They're light years ahead of us. There is an ongoing debate about US evangelicalism, right? And who's going to define its policy priorities in the future. This is a generational debate, younger evangelicals. This is a racial, ethnic, Black, indigenous, people of color who self-identify as evangelical. And this is a kind of political, ideological debate. The historic white evangelical institutions in the US sphere are National Association of Evangelicals, Christianity Today, Wheaton in terms of Christian evangelical colleges, and Gordon Conwell in terms of institutions, right? And all of those were founded, before the 70s, actually before the rise of the religious right. And when the religious right came in, they got increasing traction in those historically rooted, longstanding white evangelical organizations. They were intelligent enough to know that if they had wanted any semblance of legitimacy, they had to recruit Latino, African-American, Asian, millennial, and that is causing some negotiation around racial justice, around SNAP, around WIC, around earned income tax credit, around US aid, around foreign policy in the Northern Triangle. The truth is that white evangelicalism has had a strong influence on issues of abortion, same-sex marriage, Middle East, in Latino evangelicalism in America. A strong influence, possibly a monopoly. Some of that has changed, especially around the coast, right? East Coast, West Coast, and urban centers. But on issues like immigration, on issues like housing and economic development, that is where Latino voices are coming to the fore. The presentation of economic theory, I didn't say the economic theory in of itself, I said the presentation of the economic theory in Latino faith circles, given the economic upheaval of Venezuela, and the history of the first group of Peter Pan migrants from Cuba, and the bankruptcy and the junta placed over Puerto Rico that people like Eric LeCompte and Jubilee USA have been raising, I'm getting really into the weeds, is making the conversation around economic investment more difficult than in years past.
I don't know what opinions are among the Puerto Ricans in the US about the plight of the island and how it's being handled.
It's one of equity. I think it's a question of equity. Puerto Rico is not more in debt than Texas.
Right.
The debt of Puerto Rico is not larger than Texas.
Right.
But Texas doesn't have a junta. Puerto Rico does.
Mm-hmm.
Detroit went bankrupt, but it did not have imposed on it the economic regulations that Puerto Rico does. For that matter, the state I live in has probably greater debt than the island of Puerto Rico. And I live in Florida, or New York State, or California.
But is that true as a proportion of the economy?
The point is that
That's interesting.
that when Latinos go bankrupt, we're irresponsible. When other groups go bankrupt, they need help. And so the narrative, the political philosophy tied to the economic theory is deeply racialized.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do we, and this I get direct, right? This, let's take community development block grants, CDBGs. CDBGs, do they go to the governor or do they go to the mayor? In Puerto Rico, they go to the governor, but in other states, they go directly to the municipalities. And so these are the distinctions of, by the way, not just Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, the territories, right? And so these are the issues that require a level of analysis, both on both economic theory and how race is tied to economic theory. The Equality Act has the Latino Evangelical Church in an uproar.
Yeah.
It just, as soon as it passed the House, Jeanette and I
Is it
probably
just
got.
the affirmation of gay people? Is that
No, it's the concern of Pell Grants to Christian colleges and universities. It's the concern of federal aid to churches that run Office of Refugee Resettlement,
Our direct services.
our direct services that have federal funding. So foster care, hunger relief, natural disaster relief organizations, private Christian colleges and universities that receive Pell Grants and FAFSA. The list is long, but those are the main ones that they're concerned about.
okay?
Although that same group would say, we are for fairness for all, and they're therefore against they're against discrimination for LGBTQ plus people, but they're concerned about the lack of religious exemption in the Equality Act. So let me talk about priority issues. Now I'm getting more to policy issues. I think that what the first thing we before I get to policy issues is approach. Latino faith approaches, okay? The first hurdle that we face, and now I'm doing Latino faith in general, and then in particular Latino evangelicalism, which is my area of expertise and where I live. There's a lack of accessibility to policy analysis. With the exception of the Latino Catholic Church, most Latino indigenous faith organizations require to subcontract their policy analysis to partners. And so while we may have the larger numerical people to mobilize, we don't have the experts unless it's in partnership. Even the Latino Catholics are doing it through the larger U.S. Conference of Catholics. It's not a uniquely Latino analysis of the EITC. It's not a Latino analysis of fair housing. It's not right. It's a larger, right. And then we have to kind of parse through what are the impact for African Americans, Asians, Latinos, poor whites, Appalachia, so forth. That work, that's going to take some time because most of the organizations don't have an in-house policy person working on the Hill, getting them the day-to-day information. right? And so people want to talk about policy when there's a major hurdle around access to policy information and trustworthy contextualized translation of the policy implications for those people they seek to reach. If you're asking about priorities, most people think that immigration is the number one policy priority. It is not. It's actually economics. Before COVID, it was poverty, wages, housing. Now, post-COVID, it's COVID, and then economics. Those things are not disconnected, obviously. Okay, and so when Latino faith people are polled, overwhelmingly, immigration is not the top issue, even though people think it is. It's usually economics. Immigration is usually fourth or fifth in national polls of Hispanics. However, it's the thing we're listened to the most on. That's why we get to go. If I speak about economics, I'm a voice of many. If I speak about immigration, I'm the national leader. Living wage, child tax credits, earned income tax credit. Second, housing, affordable housing and access to affordable housing. Third, education. You know, to quote Jonathan Kozol, savage inequalities. The disparity between quality, access to quality education. We still live in a Juan Crow and Juanita Crow educational system. Okay. Criminal justice reform. A lot of work being done on unequal sentencing for similar crimes across racial, and then probably immigration. Again, why then is it seem that Latino faith groups only talk about immigration? That's because that's the only sound bites media and others play, because when we're talking about other stuff, they give the mic to somebody else. It is not because we don't care, we're not informed, we're not passionate, right? And so there is an issue between policy advocacy and messaging and messengers that needs to be kind of filtered, right? Because just because you don't see these groups leading doesn't mean it's not part of their policy priorities. It's just historically the table or the platform or microphone has not been given to those groups. It is changing. It is changing. And there's some progress on that. So let's go down these things, right? So you're talking about economics, right? You're talking about living wage. We did a living wage campaign, right? $15 an hour. We did that. Okay. Probably 6 years ago in New York, or maybe more than 7 or 8 years ago in New York. We were part of the living wage campaign, actually with Latino Mainline and the African American Church. Okay, it was led by a Latino councilman, a Puerto Rican Pentecostal councilman from the Bronx. And so those issues of living wage, of paid family leave, of earned income tax credit, the leaders are doing. The grassroots are just amening because they're living the realities, but they don't have the policy. You know, that's why when I always go to these policy meetings, I always say, no, I need a one-pager that's digestible that I can preach from my pulpit in 5 minutes or less. I need a 5-minute talking point that is easily digestible and translatable from my pulpit on Sunday morning. Okay, so if we talked about those 4 issues, and I think also international aid would be tied with the immigration. If we talked about those issues, I need to underscore that there is a vast distinction between grasstops involvement and grassroots involvement, because the grassroots is overwhelmingly informed about immigration. They don't need a policy debrief on immigration. They don't need somebody from DC to tell them, this is how immigration affects you, because they live it every day. they may need a debrief on how the budget impacts how much they get from SNAP or WIC. That connection is not made as easily.
What is NALEC doing? What is it? They don't know. So,
Okay.
how do you work? What are you trying to achieve?
So NALEC
Is it
is
working?
National Latino Evangelical Coalition. It's a coalition of Hispanic evangelical congregations working from a gospel-centered perspective for the common good. And so we do several things. We educate on policy that impacts our folks. We advocate and we mobilize. Those three things: educate, advocate, and mobilize around the issues that are in the policy space. We do other things that are squarely in the direct service space or in the leadership development space. But in the policy space, we educate, we advocate, and we mobilize. So we're part of the kind of advocacy for EITC, CTC, paid family leave. We're on all those coalitions. We have received grants, private grants, to do that advocacy work. We partner with the Circle Protection. For over 10 years, we've advocated for bipartisan, common sense, humane immigration reform. We were the first evangelical coalition in the country, not the first evangelical, but the first evangelical national coalition to take a stand against the death penalty, to publicly oppose the death penalty. No other evangelical organization has done that. We're still the only one. And we did that several years ago. And so we advocate for criminal justice reform. And we've been doing that for about 6 years. On COVID-19, we're working for the COVID-19 legislation to be approved with some permanency around EITC and CTC. And we've mobilized around that. We've done some calls with senators and congressmen and women to make sure they know our perspective on it. We have in COVID-19 talk not just about the disproportionate impact on Latinos, but also how are we going to fund USAID in a way that responds to the global pandemic. And our strength is that we're good at grass tops and excellent at grassroots mobilization. Every time there was an immigration mobilization by the Evangelical Immigration Table, the largest group was always NALEC, 400, 500 people visiting the Hill. And so we're very good at moving large groups of people, but it takes a long time. It takes a long time.
If people ask you what impact has NALEC made, what would be your top impact story? And then you really were very visible during the 2020 election. You got a lot of press, a lot of attention from candidates on both sides. What do you learn from that?
That fame is fleeting.
What?
Fame is fleeting. That at the strike of midnight, the carriage turns into a pumpkin. So here's what I learned, all joking aside, that people know that Hispanic evangelicals are quintessential swing voters in states like Arizona, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, especially the Lehigh Valley, like Allentown and Philadelphia, Florida, Colorado. And so I think that it's not so much our size, which we're about, like I said, 12 million, 13 million, whatever, depending who's counting. It's where we are. We're in swing states. They don't call me because of anything else, but because that Hispanic evangelicals and Hispanic Catholics could be determinative in the swing states. And we are historically more independent than other Latinos. The second thing I would say is that I learned that if you're going to sustain a movement and get policy across, you have to work bipartisan in this political context. The inertia is overwhelming. It's overwhelming, and in the last several years, bipartisanship has been almost impossible because because of demonizing rhetoric, because of racialized over for a lot of reasons. So I hope that bipartisan will be able, especially on things like infrastructure and economics, given the COVID-19 legislation reality. I also discovered that NALEC, while it is growing, we have a lot of work to do internally among Hispanic evangelicals, and that it comes at a high price. At a high price.
What do you mean?
Death threats,
Mm.
uh, uh,
No.
yeah, it comes at a high price. And so we've had to have armed guards. We've had to have police escort for my children to school. I testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee on sanctuary cities and immigration, and my kids had to have police escorts. And at our church, that the work of justice should not be romanticized, I think is what that a 15-minute soundbite on CNN or Telemundo and Univision is not the real story. I also learned that we need multiracial coalitions to get work done. You need multiracial coalitions. America is increasingly pluralistic and diversified, and while we're the National Latino Evangelical Coalition, we work with Barbara Williams Skinner and the African American pastors, and we've worked with the Poor People's Campaign and William Barber. You know, the problems are so systemic and so deep that they have to be multiracial and multi-generational, and multi-faith. Quite frankly, you have to reach it for issues that are almost intractable. The successes of NALEC, I think I'm things I'm most proud of is I'm proud of what we did on DACA. We did a national campaign where we did 7 states, and yeah, I'm proud of that. I am. You know, these are kids, and I'm proud of our work with unaccompanied alien children, and having our churches house them and reunite them with their parents. 600 of them. This was, I'm talking back to in the Obama administration. So I'm proud of that work. I think that was a real blessing. I'm part of some of our more local work for Living Wage and some local chapters that we got to win in some city campaigns and some statewide campaigns. We've been successful. I'm proud that Latino and Latina evangelicals have a higher profile than when we began. I think that invisibility is not as big of a challenge as before. Equity in platform is a challenge, but invisibility is not a challenge. When you're a young organization, if you don't have the support, you usually go down in 3 to 5 years. You know, we're over a decade old now. And so that it's a sustainable movement, I think is, and that we speak to a breadth of issues, and that now people go to us, right? Now people ask, hey, what are Latino evangelicals thinking about this? Where that was not even a question before. Yeah. And so like this, you know, a Latino evangelical talking to graduate students. Think about 10 years ago if that would happen on public policy, on poverty, on immigration, or there's increasing literature out there. Pew is doing stuff, Barna is doing stuff, PRRI is doing stuff, even the media, which is by far the slowest. 10 years ago, New York Times never even heard what a Latino evangelical was. It was like, what planet is that from, or whatever, you know, or the Atlantic or whatever. But now they're doing pieces, and PBS is doing, so the invisibility, that's important, because whether it's NALEC or another Latino evangelical organization, that voice is in the public sphere on important issues. Hey, can I say this has been amazing? And I am honored that my dear friend, David Beckmann, has given us the opportunity to share whatever limited information we had. And I was glad I was able to share both theological and kind of more pragmatic things. I am so glad that each of you is investing in this type of conversation. We need more people who are thoughtful in this space, no matter where they come down on the issue. At least they're thoughtful, and I couldn't think of a more qualified faculty person than David Beckmann, and so I'm honored. And I know Jeanette and I, who value David as a friend and as a leader, are thankful for each of you. If you ever want to reach out to us, I think she put the email on the chat. We're here to do that. And let me say, there are other great organizations. Esperanza with Luis Cortez is a great organization. Carlos Malave is a mainline Protestant who does great work. Alexia Salvatierra at Fuller does great work. And so we just want to be honest about, we're just one of, as the Latin Vulgate says, Jerome translating the Gospels, ego vox clamantes in deserto, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, where there are many voices out there. And so we just want to say that. So David, thanks.
Gracias a usted. Gracias a usted. Muchas gracias.